joined today by Claudia, and we're going to be talking about all things medical device branding, what it is, how to do it, why sometimes projects are more expensive or less expensive than others, and really digging deep into what a brand is and how an agency can potentially help you. But I think before we kind of go into everything that goes into a brand, I think it's really important to talk about what branding actually is, because I think Claudia and we talk about this all the time. I think people there's a bit of a misconception out there about what branding really is. So yeah, well, kind of give us an update on like what branding actually is.
That's a really interesting question. So I think the classic branding that we hear about all the time is logos, visual assets, so things that you actually visually see all the time. And that certainly is one part of branding. But I think the bigger bit that often people don't see, unless you've been through this process, is all the internal work that's done behind a brand. So in order to effectively relay a brand's visual sort of identity, you really need to understand everything that brand stands for. And there's an awful lot of different stages that you go through in order to understand who you are as a brand. And actually, I know we've spoken about this, Becca, it's really important to think of your brand actually as a person, because you are communicating as a person. And if you were just a visual identity, you would be like a cardboard cutout, where actually you are so much more than a cardboard cutout. So, you have feelings, you have emotions, you talk about things in a certain way. All these different things. You have values. That's really important. So you always stand by certain things. You have certain characteristics that are recognizable. All these things need to be fitted or need to be thought about when developing a brand. And also, same as a person, what are your goals and aspirations? It's exactly the same for a brand. So, if you're, what do you want to do in the future? So, if you're a brand that wants to, change robotics in medical device, it would be a bit more precise than that, but that's your vision of what you want to do in the future. So I think branding is so much bigger than what people often think it is, because everybody just sees that visual expression or the visual identity. But it's an iceberg. It's like a big iceberg, and you have just that small little bit on the top, which is what you see, and then a ginormous amount underneath, which is who that brand is and who that person is.
Yeah, and I think when you said that to me, that really hit home about branding, because when you think about like outside medical device Nike, everyone knows the Nike logo being the tick, but that's not what any of us connect with. What we connect with is their message about just doing it and all that aspiration and all those messages that we see from them when they're showing you really inspirational athletes, inspirational people. That's what you connect with, that sort of messaging and values, versus the swoop on your trainers. So there is a lot more to a brand than just the logo and the colors that you're using.
It's so true. It's where you're going, and it's what your characteristics are to get you there. You're absolutely true. It's a person. It's a whole thing. And when you're not a whole thing and you're just a visual identity, you are a cardboard cutout, realistically, because nobody's going to interact. Like Becca, as much as we get on really well, if you didn't speak and you didn't, or if you spoke in a different voice every day, I'd be like, whoa, what is going on here? It's actually exactly the same for brands. Or if you decided, one day you came in, like obviously now you have brown hair, and it's got natural curls in. If tomorrow you came in and, just looked totally different, it would just throw me off. And it's exactly the same for the visual identity. Pardon?
Cancel the appointment to dye my hair pink then this evening.
Yeah, exactly. But it's consistency, isn't it? So also that's it's an interesting conversation, because it also comes back to like, why do you have brand guidelines? I know this is going off topic a little bit, but why do you have brand guidelines? And it's so that you can keep that consistency all the time, so that every time somebody sees you, they trust you, they believe you, because you're authentic. So when we talk about what's authentic, it's because you're the same all the time, and because the values that are mapped out in your brand are the values you believe in. They're not there because you just say that's what you want to believe in. It's because what you do and what the company believes in, because the company is a person.
Well, we're going to talk about in a bit, I think, sort of internal branding and what that means, because that all it comes back to that, really, isn't it? That I think sometimes what you are and what you want to be are two different things, and it's really important that your brand is a reflection of who you want to be, who you are, sorry, and your vision can be who you want
Who
to
you
be.
are.
Yeah, who you are. Your vision can be who you want to be, but what you're doing every day, that's who you are, and that's what your branding should be about. Otherwise, there's going to be that disconnect, and that it just isn't authentic, like you said. Um, but then, so if it is more than just the visual expression, where do you start? Like, what's important for when you're building that brand? What do people need to think about?
So, I mean, I think it's where you want to go. It's who you are now and where you want to go. So it is that gap analysis, having a look at first of all, and looking at what your vision and what your mission is. And these often get confused. And actually, they may mean different things to different people. For us, a vision is always the long-term goal. So where do you want to get to in 10 years? What's the ultimate vision? Whereas the mission is, what am I going to do every day to get there? And that gives you that roadmap of where you want to do. And you might also have a higher purpose, but it's really understanding that as a company of where you want to get to, where you are now, where you want to get to, because that will give you a better idea, of everything about your brand. But then so you've also got your vision and your mission and where you're going, but then you've also got to understand, who are you as a company? So what are your values? How do you speak, things like that. But that also comes down to competition, or not competition really, sorry, but you've got to understand what marketplace you're sitting in. So when you say where do you start, you definitely start with where do you want to get to in the future. But there's an awful lot of background information that once you've got that, you then need to have a look at, right, what marketplace are we in? What do my audience need? What are the problems I'm solving? Because within your branding project will also include your messaging, your naming, things like that. And all of these things need to talk to where you want to get to and to your audience, of what they need to hear in order for you to get there as well. So it's so much bigger than just the visual at the end of it.
Yeah, so when you go back to your iceberg analogy, sort of all of that sort of stuff is sort of stuff that people don't see, that internal branding, like you were talking
Mm.
about your vision, your mission, all your positioning is all stuff that people don't see when they see your logo, but all has to be done for your brand to feel authentic.
Yeah, although the interesting thing is the people who do it really well, you don't see it, but they're the companies that you say it's just so simple. Like everything is so simple and it's so right because their message is so clean and it's so targeted, that then it works extremely well. So no, you don't see the work behind it, but you so can see the work behind it. When you see those companies that are so effective, it's like a good example, and this isn't within medical device, but another company. If you look at companies that were really really successful, and one company would be obviously like FedEx. Why were they so successful? They were so successful because they promoted overnight delivery, and their brand promised that they would get you things overnight. And it was so simple, but it was what their audience wanted, and that allowed them to grow hugely. But the amount of work that went behind that, understanding their customer, understanding where everybody else was within the market, understanding where they sat on those brand ladders and things like that, and in fact creating a whole new brand ladder, allowed them to really dominate the market with a very, very clear message of overnight delivery.
And there's a really good example. I think is when you've done that work and you've decided what your mission is, what your vision is, what that main differentiator is for you and your competition, then I think the next step that we
Mm.
talk about is sort of your character or your archetype, and like then which
Mm.
is how your brand persona basically. So how do you sort of explain archetypes to say someone that doesn't know what they are?
Archetypes. So archetypes aren't always used. Not everybody uses archetypes. They are hugely powerful. They certainly fit into the character side of your business. Archetypes were actually they're something that is innately within all of us. In the sense they go back in history, and there's certain groups of characteristics that come together that are very easily recognizable by people. So things like a caregiver, things like an outlaw. Apple did a very good campaign of an outlaw, which was a Think Different campaign. That was them as an outlaw to start off with, before they moved into another type of archetype. That often isn't seen. But archetypes are things that resonate very, very well with audiences. So you can create your character. Characters are made up of a certain number of traits that you have. And if you fit a certain number of traits will also fit into an archetype. I'm not explaining it very well because, archetypes are very much on their own. But you don't want to try and squeeze yourself into an archetype, because you are who you are. And that comes back to authenticity as well. So, it's really saying, right, who are we as a company? What do we believe in? What is our character? And then you can potentially align yourself with an archetype. There's a whole other podcast about archetypes. It's absolutely huge how much you can talk about. A lot of people do say be careful with archetypes because they are so powerful that they have to be used correctly. But they're certainly if anybody wants to learn more about archetypes, obviously speak to us. But alternatively, there's a fantastic book called The Hero and the Outlaw, which talks all about archetypes. And we do see them in certain medical device companies as well. But it's a type of character. But if you understand your archetype or your character, they are one and the same thing. That will then tell you what your brand voice should look like. It will tell you so much more information. So they act as really good guidelines of how to communicate moving forward. There's so much in the topic of branding. You can talk about it forever, which is a really exciting thing to discuss.
Because we could talk about the internal side, for this whole podcast, all the character stuff, all the mission and the vision. But that's only sort of one part of a branding project. What normally the next stage would be sort of your external expression. So how that internal brand is shown externally. What is sort of the key things that needs to happen during that phase of a branding project?
Well, I think before we get to external expression, you do need your verbal expression as well. So we've talked a bit about archetypes, and that's really what your characters and your traits look like. But then it's sort of like, and that will also give you ideas of, how you're going to communicate, what your brand voice will look like as well. But we then look at messaging. So once you know your positioning in the market, you know what you need to be saying, you know who your audience is, you know what your personality is. It's then talking about actually how are we going to communicate our value proposition to our audience. And that comes in our messaging. And there's lots of different structures you can follow in order to create your messaging. There's some really cool things. Story brand is one really interesting one that really is, again, that's actually based on archetypes, and that puts the customer in the position of the hero, which is a very interesting structure of how to create your core messaging. But those are really important. It's really telling it in a story so that your audience can quickly understand what you're trying to communicate, because the simple, the better when it comes to messaging. So once you understand your character, it's then about understanding your verbal expression. So how you're going to talk about things, what your messaging is going to be, what your product name is going to be, what your tagline is going to be. And then you move on to the visual expression.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
And now I can answer your original question.
Yeah. Yes. So once you've done all of that work, what happens then? I think this is the bit that people think about is branding, isn't it? Is this next step?
Yeah. Well, so once you have all of this, you know so much. By the point you even pick up a pen to start designing anything, you know everything about your brand. So you know what your values are, what your feel is, what your tone's going to be. Are you friendly? Are you more serious? Are you a caregiver in the sense of, are you looking after people? That will give you a certain color palette. Are you more of an outlaw? That will give you another color palette. So you've got to understand all of this because you want this to resonate in your visual expression. Also, are there certain things in your messaging that you can actually put in that visual expression? I can't think necessarily of examples now, but there can be a lot of things, that will then, every time somebody looks at your brand, maybe your logo, if you were talking about overnight delivery, maybe it has an arrow in it. I don't even know if FedEx does now, but
it does have
maybe it has a little arrow in it. Oh, does it? Okay, fine.
The X and the E is a secret little arrow, and I think a lot of people don't realise it's there. It's a secret little arrow.
There you go. So you see, and then suddenly you have things with real meaning, because you know everything. You know the key differentiator. You know what needs to go into that logo. You know what needs to go into all your assets because it's what your key differentiator is potentially. So suddenly it brings a whole weight to that visual expression that was just never there before. So that's all looking at the visual identity. So when we talk about visual identity, we mean logos. We mean graphic elements, how sort of brochures will look, how your website will look. And again, we've been talking before about your personality, all these different things. They all have to have that same feel, because if you're a fun creator type, it's going to probably have a lot more color in. It's probably going to be maybe a bit more spacey because it's all about thinking. It's all about, breaking new grounds. Whereas if you're an outlaw, it's going to be a bit more darker. It's going to be a bit more gritty. The imagery is going to be a bit more that way as well. And this still applies to medical device as well. You can have all these nuances and everything, but if you haven't done this initial work of understanding all these stages, you're really saying, what do I like? And that's a whole different place to start from, whereas saying, actually, what do I need to project is a really powerful and really fun place to be. And it's really interesting about that arrow being in FedEx. That makes me smile.
Yeah, no, it's one of those. I don't know where I saw it, but once you see it, whenever you see a FedEx van now, you'll see the arrow. It's
Yeah.
like a little logo that. So once you've got your logo, you mentioned there about sort of brand assets or common graphics that you use. You've done all of that. So sort of the next stage really is putting that out to people, and we've spoken about it briefly about your brand guidelines at the beginning, but where else do people need to think about changing their brand, or especially if it's a refresh? Like, what do people need to be thinking about?
I think you need to think about everything. So if it's a refresh, it depends. Thing is, it depends how much detail you're going into any of these things. Actually, this is a really interesting topic when it comes to what are the different costs of branding projects, and the answer is it depends, because there's so many different elements to things. So, if you're just doing I say just doing a refresh, what is just a refresh?
Yeah.
Is it just updating your logo? Is it changing your color palette? Is it, if you're doing a new brand, for example, you will need to think about what's your website going to look like. It needs to be rolled out on your website, business cards, PowerPoint templates, Word templates. Now in the digital age, digital business cards, all these different things really need to be thought about. But brochures, all these things, these can all be included. These tend to be a second stage. Once your visual identity is confirmed or is agreed upon, then it will start extending out into all these different areas. But it really needs to go in all, obviously, in all touch points, which is why rebrands can be so expensive, because it doesn't only impact what we see, it also impacts the office and things like that. So, all the packaging. So changing a logo is no mean feat, because it impacts so many different things. So I think, it definitely needs to be thought about how much of a rebrand you need to do, because it's going to change everything that you do.
Yeah, I think that leads nicely then to what affects then a branding project, the costs you just talked about can be no mean feat. Like, what drives the costs up? What can bring the costs down if people are working on more of a budget? Like, what impacts it?
It's really how much you want to include in it. How much do you want to include the team? The more we can include the team, the better, because they will, this is their brand at the end of the day. We're not creating something out of thin air. This is what you are already. And then, really taking you forward to where you need to be. So how many workshops need to be run? So, if you're going to go right back to basics, and you're going to look at your vision, your mission, your purpose, everything. Most of these things should really be mapped out to start off with, but maybe we're tweaking these just to make sure they're aligned for the future. And, that will include the senior leadership team. So that will be meetings with the senior leadership team. Are you going to take competitive reviews in-house, positioning? Have you already done that? Do you need an agency to do that? Those things take a long time because there's an awful lot of background research into them. So that would increase the cost if you need to do that. Defining the character, all those things will take cost. But you might just say, and this is it. I say it depends, because it also totally depends on where your business is and what it needs at this moment. Because if you're a really, if you're a young startup, and I say maybe you're even pre-commercial, it'll be a much lighter touch through this than it would if you were a big corporate, because it's not so critical. And this may be an arguable point, but if you've only got a fixed amount of money, where is best to spend that money? And is it best to spend it on a really comprehensive branding project that could cost you well over £100,000? Or is it best actually just to focus on the visual identity and a little bit of the personality, and internally you work out your purpose, mission, and vision, and we take that through very lightly and until a later stage. But if you're a larger company, then it's going to be a lot more comprehensive. Also, is it a refresh? So do you actually say to us, look, we really like most of our things here, we just want to tweak it? That's going to take a lot less in the development stages than if you say we want to totally develop a whole new brand, because that's got a lot more thinking that goes into it. So there's loads. And also then internal revisions. How many people do you want included in this project internally? Does it have to go through one team first to get sign off and then another team, or is everybody included in that team as a whole? Because that will always run faster, just because you won't have so many changes that come through. There's so many things. Does your product already have a name? Does your company already have a name? Do you have a tagline? Do you not? Do you have your core messaging? Do you not? It's endless. It really does. It depends, So what's the range of a branding project, I suppose, is probably the best way to say it. And I think if you're just doing a very simple logo refresh, which will then impact all your assets as well, and potentially your website, if you were just doing a logo refresh, it might be as little as 4,000 or 5,000. That would be just a simple logo refresh, and then putting that logo onto different assets with no color changes or anything. But if you had, full rebrand starting from beginning to end, it could go over 100,000. So it is a really big range, but it's understanding what you need for your company. And of course, that's also working with your agency to say, or working with your internal team, whoever's doing this. It doesn't have to be an agency. Saying, yes, we've done this bit. We're really comfortable with these sections of our project. We all have them in this brand guideline here. And actually, we can move comfortably through to this later stage because we understand, everything about our internal brand. So it just really does depend. There's just such a big range on these things. Yeah.
The other question that we get a lot is sort of a timeline question as well. How long is it going to take? And one thing that, before we sort of do timelines, is I think a lot of people want to change everything all at once. They're like, I want everything to launch straight away. Where actually we find that if you do your logo and your brand guidelines first, and then you change your website, it changes all those internal reviews that you were talking about. You don't want to be trying to change things all at the same time, because that won't, you need to kind of go
so you mean yeah, so make sure that things actually get signed off at certain stages.
Exactly.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's not that we would launch a brand before we had the website. It's more of the internal underlying things before it actually goes live. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So so it's making sure that it's very systemized. It has to be very systemized. And we would recommend anybody is very systemized with this. So it's definitely, get each stage signed off. Make sure everybody signs it off, because the most painful thing is that you get to the website, you've even built the wireframe, and then suddenly everything changes at the beginning. I mean, it really shouldn't happen. Really shouldn't happen, but we know it does. So yes, it is. Organization in these big projects is really critical, just to make, just to keep costs down. I think that's a really big thing about what pushes costs up and costs down. At the moment, we've spoken very much about the actual stuff that you need to do within the rebrand process. But actually, one of the biggest things that will drive cost up and down is efficiency of process. So if everything is signed off at the right time, that will significantly compress the budget.
Yeah, and I think it's also about not trying to do, we often get people say, oh, can we work on the logo and also the graphic elements at the same time? Like, let's they think it's just streamlining process to bring those two things together. But actually what will happen is the logo might go one way, the brand graphic element might go another way, and then the team might like the way the logo's gone, and you've got to redo those brand graphic elements. So actually you haven't streamlined that process by trying to do them together. Going through those steps, doing them step by step, is the most efficient way for both timelines and for cost.
Totally. It's all about the process. You're absolutely right. Because the graphic elements will include most likely parts of the logo.
Exactly.
Or elements of the logo or something like that. You're absolutely right. And also the colours, so the process that we go through when we're delivering logos is you'll first of all confirm the structure of the logo, irrelevant of colour to start off with, to make sure that you're happy with the elements, how the elements are working, that they say the right message. Then you go through colour configuration. So there's no point in looking at all the colour configurations of all the logos in round one, because actually it's not efficient use of time. So it's getting the logo configuration right, then going through all the color configurations, then looking at the whole. Yes, it all has a very fixed process, and then going on to graphic elements. And actually, the interesting thing is when you do it in that way, it's way faster overall. But it doesn't feel way faster when you're doing it, and it's a lot less frustrating for both parties because you don't have these constant changes on everything, which is what will drive costs up.
Cool. Great, that's been a really great chat about everything branding and costs. We have an article on the website where we talk about more about branding. You mentioned there about sort of future podcasts that we'll talk about archetypes, because branding is such a big topic. It's something that we'll constantly be talking about. But if you want more information about branding and how Podemos can help, there's information on our Knowledge Hub, or get in touch with us via our website, and one of the team can be in touch to help.
Perfect. Thanks, Becca. I think it's such an exciting topic. I can talk about it forever. And when it's done well, I mean, it's your branding and messaging all together. And then, of course, once you've done that, it's then all about how you distribute that message through all the channels. That's the only thing we probably haven't spoken about presence, but that's basically everything else after that point. How do you then get that out to everybody? So lovely. Thank you very much.